They called it disobedience. But it started with a king trying to display his wife. That version protects the wrong person. The story of Vashti is usually told very quickly. A queen refused. A king became furious. A crown was lost. Another woman eventually took her place. Simple. Except the story does not actually begin with Vashti saying no. It begins with King Ahasuerus saying, basically, look at everything I have. And he had a lot. The book of Esther opens with the king throwing an enormous celebration for officials, nobles, military leaders, and powerful men from across his empire. This was not dinner with friends. The celebration lasted for months. Months. Apparently, when someone ruled 127 provinces, one weekend was not enough to properly show off. Ahasuerus displayed the riches of his kingdom, the glory of his palace, and the greatness of his royal power. Everything was designed to impress. Then came another feast. More guests, more luxury, more wine, more showing off. By the seventh day, the king was cheerful from drinking, surrounded by men who had spent days watching him demonstrate exactly how rich and powerful he was. And then he decided something was missing. Vashti. The king ordered 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the guests wearing her royal crown. The reason is actually given. He wanted the people and officials to see her beauty. That detail changes the scene. He was not calling Vashti for advice. He was not inviting her because he wanted her company. He was not bringing her into some important royal discussion. He wanted to display her. The palace had been displayed. The wealth had been displayed. The power had been displayed. And now the queen was supposed to become the final exhibit. Basically, the king had spent days showing everyone his impressive possessions and apparently thought, wait, I forgot the wife. Then Vashti said, no. And suddenly that became the scandal. But that version starts in the wrong place, because before Vashti refused, the king made the request. And the request came inside a room filled with wine, powerful men, public attention, and a king whose entire celebration was built around proving how impressive he was. It is like someone trying to parade his wife in front of a room full of important people as another trophy, and then acting shocked when she refuses to participate. The problem was not only Vashti's no, it was the request that came before it. She did not refuse a quiet invitation. She interrupted a performance. And for a king who had spent months showing everyone how much power he had, one woman refusing him in front of an audience created something dangerous. Not because his kingdom was suddenly weaker, not because his army had disappeared, not because his throne was under attack, because everyone had just watched the king give an order and watched someone say no, and a no inside a palace can make more noise than a war. Vashti did not lose her crown because a king heard no. She lost it because that king could not survive being embarrassed. And embarrassment is very different when an audience is watching. Ahasuerus had just spent months displaying power. His wealth was enormous. His palace was impressive. His authority stretched across 127 provinces. Nobody in that banquet needed convincing that he was the king. But then Vashti refused his command. In public. That was the crack. The Bible says the king became furious and burned with anger. But look at what had actually happened. No army had invaded. No province had rebelled. No enemy had entered the palace. His wife had refused to appear. That was enough. Because this was not only happening between husband and wife. Powerful men were watching. The same men Ahasuerus had spent all that time trying to impress had just seen something he probably never planned to include in the royal presentation. A limit. The king could command provinces. He could summon officials. He could fill a palace with gold and wine. But he had summoned Vashti. And Vashti had not come. That was not dangerous to his authority. It was dangerous to his image of authority. And those are not the same thing. A secure king could have survived the moment. An embarrassed king surrounded by an audience. Apparently that required experts, because nothing says absolute imperial power quite like needing an emergency consultation after your wife says no. Ahasuerus turned to the wise men who understood law and custom. Think about that for a second. A queen refuses to attend a banquet, and suddenly the legal department is involved. The question was no longer simply what happened between Vashti and the king. Now the question was what should be done to her. That shift matters. Because once wounded pride starts looking for punishment, the goal is rarely understanding. The goal is recovering control. It is like someone being contradicted during an important meeting and, instead of moving on, turning the embarrassment into an official crisis. The public humiliation becomes bigger than the actual event, and that is exactly where Ahasuerus was heading. The problem was not that he lacked authority. The problem was that his authority seemed so fragile that one refusal had to be crushed for him to keep looking powerful. Vashti had not taken his throne. She had not challenged his empire. She had not organized a rebellion. She had simply refused to participate in the scene he had planned. But in a room built around the king's greatness, that refusal exposed something all the gold could not cover. He could control the banquet. He could control the command. He could not control the answer. And apparently nothing threatens a giant empire more than a woman saying no at the wrong moment. Of course. So the king's embarrassment moved from emotion to consultation. And once the advisors began talking, Vashti's refusal was about to become much larger than Vashti herself. The wounded pride of one king was about to become official policy. Then the advisors stepped in, and Vashti's no stopped being a palace problem. It became a national threat. This is where the story gets almost ridiculous. The king asks what should be done, and one advisor, Memucan, has an answer. According to him, Vashti had not only wronged the king, no, apparently she had wronged every official and every man across the empire. That escalated quickly. One woman refused one command at one banquet, and suddenly they were discussing the stability of households across 127 provinces. Memucan's fear was simple. Other women might hear about it. They might learn that Queen Vashti had refused the king. And then, brace yourself, they might start disrespecting their own husbands. So Vashti's refusal was no longer treated as one decision made by one woman. It became contagious, a dangerous example. Because apparently nothing threatens an empire like people realizing that someone else has already said no. Sometimes a system does not fear the refusal itself. It fears other people discovering that refusal is possible. That was the real panic. Vashti had not started a movement. She had not sent letters across Persia saying, "Ladies, big news." She had not organized anything. She had simply refused to appear. The advisors did the rest. They took one uncomfortable moment and inflated it until it looked like a social emergency. It is like an entire company going into crisis because one employee refuses to participate in a public humiliation and everyone else notices. The refusal becomes dangerous because now the room has seen an alternative. Someone did not cooperate. And the ceiling did not collapse. Memucan predicted contempt, anger, disorder. All because Vashti said no once. The men were practically forecasting the domestic collapse of the empire before dessert was finished. That tells the audience something important. Vashti's no did not create their insecurity. It exposed it. If their authority had been as stable as they claimed, one queen's refusal would not have required an empire-wide response. But they were not thinking only about Vashti anymore. They were thinking about imitation. What if other women heard? What if they questioned? What if they refused? What if one no became many? And once fear reaches that point, punishment stops being about the original event. It becomes a warning. The advisors needed Vashti's refusal to end badly enough that nobody would want to copy it. So Memucan proposed a solution. Remove Vashti from the king's presence. Give her royal position to someone else. Then send a decree throughout the empire declaring that every man should rule his own household. One refusal, one embarrassed king, one nervous group of advisors, and now the entire empire needed paperwork. The problem had officially outgrown the room where it started. Vashti said no once. The men around the king turned that no into a threat, and once power decides that resistance might spread, the next move becomes painfully predictable. Replace the person who resisted, and make sure everyone sees what happened. And this is where the punishment stops looking like correction. It becomes replacement. He replaced her. Memucan's proposal was simple. Vashti should never again come before King Ahasuerus. Her royal position should be given to someone else, someone better, or at least someone more acceptable to the king. That was the solution. Not a conversation, not a private consequence, not even a temporary punishment. Removal. Vashti had refused one command, so the answer was to make sure she could never stand in that position again. And then the decree went out, across the empire, because apparently removing one queen was not enough. Everyone needed to know why. The message had to travel. The king's embarrassment had become law, and Vashti's punishment had become an example. That is what makes the scene heavier than a simple argument between a king and a queen. The punishment was public because the refusal had been public. The men around Ahasuerus were not only trying to deal with Vashti, they were trying to control what everyone learned from Vashti. She said no. She lost access to the king. She lost her royal position. And eventually the palace began looking for someone else. He replaced her. That is the part people often remember only because it opens the door to Esther. And yes, Esther will become central to everything that follows. But before Esther enters the story, there is an empty place beside the king. And that place became empty because Vashti refused to perform on command. The king had wanted to display her as proof of his greatness. When she refused, he displayed the punishment instead. That irony is hard to miss. First, Vashti was supposed to become part of the spectacle. Then her removal became part of the spectacle. Either way, the palace needed everyone watching. It is like publicly firing someone who refused to be used, not only because that person resisted, but because the rest of the room needs to understand what resistance costs. That was the message. Not simply, Vashti is gone. But this is what happens when someone says no to power in front of an audience. And the strange thing is that none of this made Ahasuerus look more secure. He ruled an enormous empire. He had servants, laws, wealth, armies, officials, and provinces under his authority. Yet one refusal had produced anger, advisors, legal discussion, a royal decree, and eventually a new queen. That is a lot of machinery for one word. No. Vashti lost the crown. But the reaction revealed something about the crown itself. If keeping it required obedience to every public demand, then the crown was not only a symbol of honor. It could also become a leash. The king preferred an empty place beside him to a queen who had refused him, and soon that empty place would be filled. But the reason it was empty would not disappear. Vashti had said no, and the palace had decided that no could not remain crowned. Vashti said no, and lost her crown because the king turned her refusal into a threat to his own pride. That is the center of the story. He called. She refused. He felt exposed. The advisors made the danger bigger. The palace reacted, and Vashti was replaced. It sounds simple when compressed into a few lines, but the sequence matters. Because Vashti did not wake up one morning and decide to challenge an empire. She did not march into the throne room demanding reform. She did not gather supporters. She refused to appear when the king ordered her to be displayed before his guests. That was enough. And once the king's embarrassment became public, the reaction stopped being proportional to the event. A refusal became disrespect. Disrespect became danger. Danger became policy. And policy removed the queen. That is how quickly power can turn one uncomfortable moment into something much larger. The story does not need Vashti to become a flawless hero for that to be obvious. The Bible does not spend chapters explaining her motives. It gives the refusal, then it shows the reaction. And sometimes the reaction tells the audience more than the refusal ever could, because not every no is powerful because of how loudly it is spoken. Some are powerful because of what they reveal in the person who cannot accept hearing it. Ahasuerus had enormous authority. He ruled provinces. He commanded officials. He issued decrees. He had wealth most people could barely imagine. But when Vashti refused him, all of that power suddenly looked strangely nervous. One woman did not appear, and an empire started writing laws. That is not exactly the picture of calm authority. Vashti lost the crown, but Ahasuerus exposed something too. His authority was enormous when everyone obeyed. It looked much smaller when one person did not. It is like someone losing a position not because they failed at the job, but because they refused to become a decorative piece in somebody else's performance. And that is why Vashti's story still lands. Not because every detail fits neatly into a modern category, not because she has to be turned into a symbol she never claimed to be, but because the pattern is recognizable. Someone powerful makes a demand, someone refuses. The refusal creates embarrassment. The embarrassment becomes anger. The anger demands a consequence. And suddenly the person who said no is treated like the problem. Vashti said no. The king replaced her. But replacing her did not erase what happened. If anything, it made the moment bigger. He wanted everyone to see his power. Instead, everyone saw how much effort it took to protect that power from one refusal. She said no. He replaced her. But it was his pride that ended up exposed. Which misunderstood Bible story should be simplified next? Esther, Jezebel, or Delilah?